The Atlantic Ocean does not like to share its secrets. And in 1921, it claimed one of the greatest ships ever built. Her name was the Carroll A. Deering. She wasn't just a boat. She was a masterpiece of oak and steel, a massive, five-masted schooner. Built in the shipyards of Maine for one thing: speed. Her sails were so large they could catch a breeze from miles away. Her hull was painted a bone white that glowed in the moonlight. To the people of Virginia, she was the pride of the American merchant fleet. But as she prepared for her maiden voyage to Brazil, the old sailors on the pier didn't cheer. They whispered, they pointed at the white paint, and they shook their heads. In the world of the deep sea, a ship that looks too perfect, eyes a target. They said the ocean is a jealous god, and it doesn't like things that stay too clean for too long. On a hot August morning, the Deering pulled up her anchors. The chains rattled like a warning. She was headed for Rio de Janeiro. Her hold was filled with coal. Her crew was young, strong, and full of life. They thought they were invincible. They thought they were sailing the strongest ship in the world. They didn't know that by Christmas, their names would be written in the sand, and their bodies would be part of the tide. The voyage down was beautiful. The sun was bright. The wind was steady. But as they reached the coast of South America, the weather changed, and so did the men. The ship was fine, but something inside the wood was starting to rot. A ship is only as good as the man at the wheel, and the Carroll A. Deering was about to change hands, just as the ship was preparing to return to the United States. Her original captain fell deathly ill. He had to be dragged off the ship in a stretcher. The company was desperate. They couldn't let $1 million cargo sit in a foreign port. So, they hired Willis Wormel. He was 72 years old, a legend of the sea, but he was a man of the old world. Hard, strict, and he didn't tolerate mistakes. He brought his son along as his first mate, and the moment they stepped on deck, the energy shifted. The crew was young and wild. They wanted to drink. They wanted to celebrate their successful voyage. But Wormel locked the cabinets. He cut the rations. He treated 10 grown men like disobedient children. By the time they reached the middle of the Atlantic, the tension was a physical thing. You could feel it in the air, thicker than the humidity. The first mate, a man named McClellan, was a drunk with a short fuse. In a bar during a supply stop, he stood up in front of a dozen strangers. He pounded his fist on the table, and he screamed that he was going to kill Captain Wormel. He said the old man was a tyrant, and that he wouldn't let him reach the coast of Maine alive. The strangers just laughed. They thought it was just the rum talking. But McClellan wasn't laughing. He went back to the ship, and he stayed in his cabin, sharpening his knife. For 3 days, the ship was silent. No one spoke. No one looked each other in the eye. The Carroll A. Deering was sailing north, but she wasn't being led by her captain anymore. She was being led by hate, and the ocean was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. 90 miles off the coast of North Carolina, there is a place called Cape Lookout. On January 28th, a lightship keeper named Captain Jacobson was on duty. The fog was thick, a heavy gray blanket that swallowed the horizon. Suddenly, out of the mist, a massive white shape drifted toward him. It was the Carroll A. Deering. She was sailing too close to the shoals. Way too close. Jacobson stood on his deck, watching the ghost white ship glide past. A man appeared at the railing of the Deering. He wasn't wearing a captain's uniform. He was wearing a dirty sweater. His hair was matted, and his eyes were wide. He lifted a heavy megaphone to his mouth. His voice was thin. Strange. He shouted that the Deering had lost both anchors in a storm. He asked Jacobson to report it to the owners, but Jacobson felt a chill. The man didn't talk like a sailor. The words were right, but the rhythm was dead, like a man reciting a poem while someone pointed a gun at his back. Jacobson looked behind the man. On the main deck, the entire crew was standing in a line. They weren't working. They weren't adjusting the sails. They were just staring. 10 men, shoulder to shoulder, watching Jacobson with empty eyes. No one waved. No one asked for a rescue. Above them, the rigging of the Deering creaked in the wind, a sound like bones scraping on wood. Jacobson shouted back. He asked if they needed immediate help. The man with the megaphone didn't answer. He just turned around and walked into the dark. One by one, the crew followed him. The Carroll A. Deering vanished back into the fog, heading straight for the graveyard of the Atlantic. Captain Jacobson ran to his radio room. He had to warn the Coast Guard. The Deering was headed for the Diamond Shoals, a place where the ocean turns into a meat grinder for ships. He flipped the switches, but all he heard was static. A loud, violent, hissing sound, like 1,000 snakes in a small room. He checked the wires. Everything was connected. He tried again, and that's when he heard it. Underneath the noise of the static, a faint signal broke through. A voice was singing. It was a low, slow, deep sea shanty, a song about dead men coming home to a dry harbor. The voice was distorted, cracking under the weight of the interference. But every time the song stopped, Jacobson heard a rhythmic tapping. Click, click, click. It sounded like someone tapping a metal pipe against the hull. Jacobson looked out at the fog. He knew the Deering didn't have a working radio. The equipment had been smashed days ago during a storm. So, where was the signal coming from? For 2 hours, he fought with the dials, trying to scream into the microphone. But the ocean was a wall of silence. It was as if the laws of physics around Cape Lookout had been altered. On board the Deering, the line between the living and the dead was blurring. Captain Wormill was no longer on the bridge. He had locked himself in his cabin, listening to the footsteps outside his door. Steps that were too heavy for a human. Steps that were wet, like something had crawled out of the bilge and into the hallway. He held his pistol in a shaking hand. The lamps flickered, and then the ship went dark. The Carroll A. Deering was no longer a vessel. She was a coffin, floating on a sea of shadows. January 31st, 1921. The Coast Guard finally reached the hull of the Carroll A. Deering. She was grounded hard on the outer edge of Diamond Shoals. The Atlantic waves were hitting her side like massive iron sledgehammers. White foam was exploding over the railing. But as the rescue team climbed the wet rope ladder, the world just stopped. The moment their boots hit the wooden deck, the roar of the ocean seemed to fade into a dull hum. It was a museum of the living. The sails were still set. The flags were snapped tight in the freezing wind. But there wasn't a single soul to greet them. No captain barking orders. No crew pulling ropes. Just the sound of the wind whistling through the rigging. A sound that felt like a long, slow sigh. The men walked toward the galley. The ship's kitchen. The smell of salt was suddenly replaced by something impossible. Fresh beef stew. And hot coffee. They stepped inside and stopped dead in their tracks. The stove was still warm to the touch. A large pot of food was sitting on the burner, prepared for a dinner that never happened. On the table, the plates were laid out in perfect lines. The silverware was straight. The coffee was still steaming in the pot. It looked like 11 grown men had just evaporated, right in the middle of a sentence. One rescuer noticed a chair knocked over in the corner, like someone had stood up in a violent hurry. But there was no blood, no signs of a struggle. No spent shell casings on the floor, just the steam rising from the cups. And the feeling that they were being watched by eyes they couldn't see. The team moved deeper into the ship, their flashlights cutting through the heavy darkness of the lower decks. Every door they pushed open revealed a life that had been cut short in a single second. In the crew's quarters, the beds were unmade. Personal trunks were wide open. Inside, they saw gold watches, wallets filled with cash, letters from wives and mothers back in Maine. In the world of the merchant marines, you never leave your boots, and you never leave your money, unless you are dead, or you are running from something much worse than death. Suddenly, a scratching sound came from under the captain's table. Every man in the room reached for his holster. A pair of glowing yellow eyes emerged from the shadows. It was a cat. A small, gray, six-toed polydactyl cat. The ship's mascot. He didn't run. He didn't meow for help. He just sat there, grooming his paws with an intensity that felt unnatural. He looked well-fed. He looked calm, as if he had spent the last 3 days watching a horror movie, and he was the only one who enjoyed the ending. One of the men tried to reach out to him. The cat didn't move. He just hissed. A low, vibrating sound that didn't belong to a house pet. It sounded like a warning. The investigators checked the master's cabin. It was the only room that was a mess. The bed sheets were torn. The captain's trunk had been smashed open with an axe, but his spare boots were still tucked neatly under the bed. They checked the lifeboats. 3 were missing, but the falls, the ropes used to lower them, were cut, not untied. They had been sliced with a sharp blade from the inside. Whoever left the Deering wasn't trying to survive a shipwreck. They were trying to escape the ship itself, and they were in a hell of a hurry to get away. The investigators didn't just find an empty ship. They found a crime scene that defied all logic. In the captain's quarters, the bed was made with military precision. The sheets were pulled tight, but on the floor, they found a maritime chart that had been torn into jagged pieces. When they carefully taped the fragments back together, they realized the map didn't show the route to the harbor. It showed a path that led directly into the heart of the shoals. The shallowest, most lethal part of the graveyard of the Atlantic. Whoever was at the wheel was trying to destroy the Carroll A Deering. But it gets darker. The ship's official logbook, the heartbeat of any vessel, was gone. Someone had spent time carefully removing every record of the last 4 days. They checked the first mate's cabin next. There, tucked inside a hollowed-out Bible, they found a private diary. The last entry was dated January 28th. The handwriting was a frantic scrawl. The ink was smudged by sweat or seawater. It spoke of a dark shadow that had been following the ship for miles. It spoke of the crew becoming silent. Too silent. The first mate wrote that Captain Wormel was no longer in command. He wrote that the men had found something in the lower hold. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. But before he could name it, the sentence just stopped. The investigators looked at each other in the dim light. They realized they weren't just looking for 11 missing men. They were looking for a murderer who might still be on board. Or something that the ocean had vomited up. And the only witness, the 6-toed cat, just watched them from the corner of the room, his yellow eyes reflecting the cold steel of their lanterns. The disappearance of the Deering became a national obsession. The FBI was called in to lead the investigation. They tracked every sailor in every port from Maine to Brazil. And then, a breakthrough. A message was found in a glass bottle, washed up on the white sands of a beach in North Carolina. The note was written on a scrap of paper. It said, "Deering captured by oil tanker. Crew taken to a pirate ship. Save us." The FBI went into a frenzy. They searched every oil tanker in the Atlantic. They raided secret hideouts in the Caribbean. They looked for modern-day pirates with high-powered guns. But then, the truth came out like a cold slap to the face. The man who found the bottle was a local fisherman. He had forged the note himself. He wanted the reward money. He wanted the fame of being the one who solved the mystery. When the note was proven to be a lie, the investigation hit a brick wall. There was no tanker. There were no pirates. There was only a white ship, full of fresh food, full of unspent cash, and completely empty of human life. The government spent thousands of dollars, interviewing over 100 witnesses, but they found nothing. No bodies ever washed up on the shore. No debris from the lifeboats was ever found. In a sea that usually spits out everything it swallows, the crew of the Carroll A Deering simply ceased to exist. Was it a mutiny? Did the men kill the old captain and flee into the fog? If they did, where did they go? And why did they leave their money behind? The ocean was silent, and the files were marked with a single word: unsolved. The ocean was not finished with the Carroll A Deering. For months, the white hull sat on the Diamond Shoals like a giant skeleton, a monument to a mystery that the United States government couldn't solve. It became a hazard, a ghost that haunted other sailors passing by in the night. In March of 1921, the authorities decided that the Deering had to die. They didn't want a reminder of their failure. They packed the beautiful oak hull with hundreds of pounds of dynamite. The explosion was deafening. A massive pillar of fire and white wood ripped through the Atlantic sky. The Carroll A Deering was shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The waves carried the debris away. Bits of the 5 masts, scraps of the bone-white sails, chunks of the deck, where 11 men once stood. All of it was swallowed by the tide, scattered across the graveyard of the Atlantic. But even today, when the storm clouds gather over North Carolina, and the lightning hits the water just right, the locals say they can still see her. A white shadow moving silently under the waves. The 11 men who sailed her never came home. No bodies ever washed up on the sand. No lifeboats were ever spotted by a passing plane. In a world of facts and figures, the crew of the Deering remains a ghost in the machine. A story with a beginning, a middle, but no end. So, what really happened on that 5-masted schooner? Was it a bloody mutiny led by a drunken first mate? Did they kill the old captain and vanish into the fog of the Caribbean? Or did they encounter something in the Bermuda Triangle? Something that doesn't leave tracks. Something that only leaves empty plates and warm coffee. The FBI files are still open, but they are covered in dust. The only living soul who knew the truth was the 6-toed cat. He was rescued from the wreck before the dynamite blew it apart. He was taken to a cozy home on the mainland. He lived for years, sleeping by the fireplace, staring out the window at the distant ocean. But he never made a sound. He never told the world what he saw in that galley. On the night the plates were set for a dinner that no one would ever eat. Maybe the ocean didn't steal the crew. Maybe the ship itself decided it was tired of being a vessel, and it became a gateway. If you ever find yourself on the coast of North Carolina, standing on the sand at midnight, listen to the wind. If you hear the sound of a bell ringing underwater, or the faint smell of fresh beef stew on a cold breeze, turn around and walk away. Because the Atlantic doesn't just take ships, it takes witnesses. I'm Mrs. Ballenina, and the sea always keeps its secrets. I'll see you in the next story.